The moment Victoria Everett's father ordered her to burn her books in the town square, she knew her life in Weaverville, California, would never be the same. It was September of 1878, and the autumn air carried the scent of pine from the Trinity Mountains while the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street. Victoria stood in the center of a gathering crowd, her arms wrapped protectively around a crate containing every book she owned. 23 precious volumes that represented years of saving and trading and begging merchants who passed through their small mining town. Her father, George Everett, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in stern disapproval. Beside him waited Harold Pritchard, a widower of 42 with 3 young children and a prosperous dry goods store. Harold had made his intentions clear for months, and her father had finally accepted his proposal on Victoria's behalf without bothering to consult her. She was 22 years old, well past the age most women married in this rugged corner of California, and her father's patience had worn thin. "You will marry Mr. Pritchard next Sunday," her father announced, loud enough for the assembled townspeople to hear. "You will be a proper wife and mother to his children. This nonsense with books ends today. A woman has no need for such foolishness." Victoria's hands trembled as she clutched the crate tighter. Inside were volumes of Shakespeare and Dickens, a copy of Jane Eyre that had traveled with her family from Missouri, books on history and geography and natural science. They were her companions during long, lonely evenings, her teachers when the town's schoolhouse had closed for lack of funding, her windows into worlds beyond the narrow confines of Weaverville's muddy streets and rough lumber buildings. "I will not marry Mr. Pritchard," Victoria said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins, "and I will not burn my books." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Women whispered behind their hands, while men shook their heads. Victoria's mother had died 3 years earlier from fever, and without her gentle mediation, the conflict between father and daughter had escalated into open warfare. Victoria worked as a seamstress, barely earning enough to contribute to the household, spending every spare moment reading or teaching the few children whose parents would allow it. "Then you are no daughter of mine," her father said, his voice cold as mountain snow. "Take your books and leave my house. See how far your precious reading gets you when you are hungry and alone." Victoria felt the words like a physical blow, but she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She had known this moment might come, had felt it approaching like distant thunder. "I will leave," she said clearly, "and I will take my books with me." She turned and walked through the parted crowd, her worn boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. Behind her, she heard Harold Pritchard's voice raised in protest, her father's curt response. She did not look back. She carried the crate to the small boarding house where Mrs. Chen, a Chinese widow, rented rooms to miners and drifters. With the few coins she had saved, Victoria secured a tiny room under the eaves for 1 week. After that, she had no idea what she would do. That night, lying on the narrow bed, with her books stacked carefully against the wall, Victoria allowed herself to cry. Not from regret she would make the same choice 1,000 times over, but from the sheer terror of uncertainty. She had no family now, no protection, barely any money. In 1878, a woman alone in a rough mining town faced dangers she had only read about in novels. But the alternative, marrying a man she did not love, giving up the one thing that made her feel truly alive, was unthinkable. The next morning, Victoria walked to the small dress shop where she did piecework, only to find the owner, Mrs. Blackwell, waiting with an uncomfortable expression. "I am sorry, dear, but I cannot employ you anymore. Your father came by this morning. He said, well, he made it clear that any business that helps you will face certain difficulties. I have a family to think of." Victoria nodded numbly and left without arguing. She tried 2 other establishments where she occasionally found work and received similar rejections. By noon, she understood the full extent of her father's influence and anger. George Everett was not a wealthy man, but he was respected, a founding member of the town's Merchants Association. His word carried weight, and he had used it to ensure his wayward daughter would find no shelter in Weaverville. She spent the afternoon sitting by the creek that ran past the eastern edge of town, watching the water tumble over smooth stones while trying to formulate a plan. She could travel to Red Bluff or perhaps even to Sacramento, but she had barely enough money for a week's room and board, let alone passage on a stagecoach. She could try to find work in one of the mining camps scattered through the mountains, but those were brutal places for any woman, especially one alone and unprotected. As the sun began its descent toward the ridge of mountains, casting the town in golden light, Victoria heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see a rider leading a pack mule, both animals dusty from travel. The man wore the typical garb of a working cowboy, though the land around Weaverville was more suited to mining and logging than cattle ranching. His hat was pulled low against the sun, and as he drew closer, she could see he was young, perhaps no more than 25 or 26, with dark hair and sun-weathered skin. He stopped when he saw her sitting by the creek and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Afternoon, miss. Mind if I water my animals here?" "It is not my creek to grant permission for," Victoria said, aware of how tired her voice sounded. The cowboy dismounted with easy grace and led his horse and mule to the water. While they drank, he studied Victoria with keen brown eyes that seemed to take in everything: her worn dress, her dejected posture, the redness around her eyes from crying. "You look like someone whose world just turned upside down," he said conversationally. "I know that particular expression. Wore it myself a time or two." Despite everything, Victoria felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That is an accurate assessment." "Ian Oakes," he said, extending his hand. "Late of Nevada, Colorado, and points north. Currently traveling to wherever the work takes me." Victoria hesitated, then shook his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "Victoria Everett, currently of nowhere in particular." Ian's eyebrows rose slightly. "Everett, any relation to George Everett who runs the feed store?" "I was his daughter until yesterday." Understanding dawned in Ian's eyes. "I see. Came into town this morning just as the gossip mill was grinding at full speed. Heard tell of a woman who chose books over a husband and got herself cast out for it. That would be you, I take it." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. News travels quickly in small towns. "Always does," Ian agreed. He settled himself on a nearby rock, apparently in no hurry to move along. "For what it is worth, I think you made the right choice. A person should not have to give up who they are to make someone else comfortable." The simple validation, coming from a complete stranger, brought tears to Victoria's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. The right choice and the practical choice are not always the same thing. "True enough," Ian said. He pulled a piece of jerky from his saddlebag and offered her half. When she shook her head, he shrugged and bit into it himself. "So what is your plan now?" "I am working on formulating one," Victoria admitted. "So far, it mostly involves hoping something occurs to me before my money runs out in 6 days." Ian chewed thoughtfully, his gaze distant. "You know," he said slowly, "I have been thinking lately that it is about time I stopped drifting and settled somewhere, built something permanent. I have saved enough for a good piece of land, maybe some cattle or horses. Problem is, homesteading is lonely work, and a man gets tired of his own company after a while." Victoria looked at him warily, wondering if this was leading where she feared. "I am sure you will find a wife eventually, Mr. Oakes." "Ian," he corrected. "And I am not looking for eventual. I am thinking about right now." He met her eyes directly. "Here is my proposal, and I want you to hear me out before you say no. You need a fresh start, somewhere your father's anger cannot reach you. I need a partner, someone to help build a homestead and make it into something real. I have been traveling through this country for months now, looking for the right spot. Found some good land about 40 miles northwest of here, near a little settlement called Lewiston. Good water, timber, flat areas for planting." "Mr. Oakes," Victoria began. but he held up his hand. I am not finished. I heard what people were saying in town about how you chose books over a husband. Seems to me that is a false choice. Why should a person not have both? You marry me, we file for a homestead together, and you can read all the books you want. Keep them. Buy more when we can afford it. Teach children, if that is what interests you. I will not demand you give up who you are. In return, you help me build a home. Be my partner in making something lasting. Victoria stared at him, completely taken aback. You cannot be serious. We have known each other for all of 10 minutes. True, Ian acknowledged. But consider your alternatives. You stay here, you will be destitute inside a week, and this is not a kind town to women in that position. You try to make it to one of the cities. You will be alone and vulnerable on the road. And then alone and vulnerable in a place where you know no one. Or you can take a chance on a man who is at least being honest about what he wants. Which is what exactly? Victoria asked suspiciously. Why would you make such an offer to a complete stranger? Ian was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. My mother could read, he said finally. Not just letters and such, but really read. Books, newspapers, anything she could get her hands on. My father beat her for it regularly, said it was above her station, that it made her forget her place. She taught me anyway, in secret, both to read and to value it. She died when I was 14, and I have been on my own ever since. He looked at Victoria with something like recognition in his eyes. When I heard about a woman who would rather lose everything than give up her books, I thought, that is someone who understands what matters. That is someone worth knowing. Victoria's throat tightened. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not this raw honesty. And if we find we cannot stand each other, then we will figure it out when we get there, Ian said practically. I am not promising you a fairy tale, Victoria. It will be hard work, probably harder than anything you have done before. The cabin I can build this winter will be small and rough. We will eat simple food and wear simple clothes, but it will be yours as much as mine. Your name on the deed, your say in decisions, your books on the shelves, and I give you my word I will never raise a hand to you in anger. Victoria looked at this stranger who was offering her impossible things, safety, and freedom in the same breath. It was insane. It was reckless. It was also the only real option she had. I do not love you, she said bluntly. I do not love you either, Ian replied just as bluntly. But I like what I have seen so far, and I respect what you are willing to sacrifice for. That seems like a decent foundation to build on. You said books over a husband was a false choice, Victoria said slowly. What you are offering is books and a husband. Books and a partner, Ian corrected. Husband is just the legal term. Partner is what I am actually proposing. Victoria stood and walked to the edge of the creek, watching the water flow past, constant and unchanging. Behind her, she could see the roofline of her father's house, the town that had rejected her, the narrow future she had refused. Ahead, in a direction she could not even see, lay unknown territory, danger and opportunity mixed together. She thought of all the books she had read, all the heroines who had faced impossible choices. None of them had ever found safety by playing it safe. She turned back to Ian Oakes, this stranger with his honest eyes and his impossible offer. If I say yes, we leave tomorrow. I will not spend one more day in this town than necessary. Ian stood and extended his hand again. Then we leave tomorrow. You have my word. Victoria took his hand and they shook on it, solemnly, like business partners signing a contract, which, she supposed, was exactly what they were. That evening, Victoria returned to her tiny room and packed her few belongings. She had 3 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's Bible with the family records inscribed inside, a cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, and her 23 books. Everything fit into 2 bundles that she could carry. She looked around the bare room with its slanted ceiling and single small window, and felt nothing but relief. She had lived in Weaverville her entire life, but it had never truly felt like home. Maybe nowhere had. Ian arrived at dawn with a gentle mare he had purchased the previous evening. "Thought you might prefer riding to walking 40 miles, he said with a slight smile. He had also bought basic supplies, flour and beans and coffee, dried meat and some salt. He must have spent a significant portion of his savings, Victoria realized, preparing for her arrival. As they led the animals down the main street in the pale early light, Victoria saw her father standing in front of his store. He watched them pass without expression, his arms crossed over his chest. Victoria felt a pang of something, not quite grief, not quite regret, sadness perhaps, for what could have been if he had been a different man, if she had been a different daughter. She did not wave or call out, and neither did he. Some separations were too complete for gestures. They traveled northwest along rough trails that wound through pine forests and across mountain meadows already touched with autumn gold. Ian was an easy companion, content with long silences but willing to talk when conversation felt natural. He told her about his years drifting from place to place, working cattle drives and doing ranch work, always saving, always planning for the day when he would have his own land. Victoria told him about her mother, who had encouraged her reading despite her father's disapproval, about the joy she found in stories and learning. On the second day, as they climbed a ridge that offered sweeping views of the mountains, Ian pulled his horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing to a valley below. "That is where I am thinking we should settle." Victoria looked down at the land spread out before them. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, bordered by cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered gold in the breeze. Grassy meadows sloped gently upward to forested hillsides. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was beautiful, wild and untouched, full of possibility. "It is perfect," she breathed. They reached the tiny settlement of Lewiston late that afternoon. It was hardly more than a cluster of buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few houses, but the people seemed friendlier than those in Weaverville. Ian made arrangements with the land office, filing his claim on 160 acres in the valley they had seen. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, barely glanced at Victoria. It was 1878, and the Homestead Act allowed single women to file claims, but married couples were more common and raised fewer eyebrows. "When are you planning to marry?" the clerk asked, his pen poised over the paperwork. Ian looked at Victoria. "Tomorrow, if the lady is willing." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest, but she nodded. "Tomorrow." They found a minister in one of the houses, an elderly man who served the spiritual needs of Lewiston and the surrounding homesteads. He agreed to perform the ceremony the following morning. That night, Ian paid for 2 rooms at the only boarding house, and Victoria lay awake in the darkness, trying to comprehend the speed with which her life had transformed. 4 days ago, she had been living in her father's house, unmarried and seemingly destined to remain that way. Now she was about to become the wife of a man she barely knew, about to begin a life in the wilderness. She waited for panic to set in, but instead, she felt a strange calm. Everything she had was already lost or else carried with her in those 2 small bundles. She had nothing more to lose and everything to gain. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The wedding took place in the minister's small parlor, with his wife and the boarding house owner as witnesses. Victoria wore her best dress, which was not saying much, and Ian had shaved and cleaned up as best he could. The ceremony was brief and simple. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ian kissed her cheek gently, more like a friend than a lover, and Victoria felt grateful for his restraint. They spent the rest of the day purchasing supplies, everything they would need to survive the coming winter while building their homestead. Canvas for a temporary shelter, tools for construction, more food, blankets, a small sheet metal stove, seed for spring planting. Ian consulted Victoria on every purchase, asking her opinion, listening to her suggestions. She began to understand that he had meant what he said about partnership. As September turned to October, they established themselves on their land. Ian built a sturdy canvas shelter nestled against a rock outcropping that provided shelter from the wind. Inside, he created a wooden platform that kept them off the damp ground, with space for their supplies and a small area where Victoria arranged her books on a makeshift shelf. He chopped wood tirelessly, building a stockpile for winter. Victoria learned to cook over an open fire, to wash clothes in the cold stream, to help with the countless tasks that survival required. It was hard work, harder than anything Victoria had experienced in town. Her hands developed blisters that turned to calluses. Her muscles ached from labor she had never performed before. But there was also a satisfaction to it, seeing tangible results from their efforts, watching their camp become more organized and comfortable each day. Ian began work on a cabin, cutting and trimming logs, hauling them to the building site he had chosen on a slight rise overlooking the stream. Victoria helped as she could, and when she could not help physically, she worked on their other needs, tending the fire, preparing food, washing and mending their clothes. In the evenings, after they had eaten and cleaned up, they would sit by the fire and Victoria would read aloud from her books. Ian listened with rapt attention, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply lost in the story. One evening, as she finished a chapter of David Copperfield, Ian said quietly, "I had forgotten how much I loved this. Hearing stories, I mean. My mother used to read to me when I was small, before my father forbade it." Victoria looked at him across the fire, at his face illuminated by the flickering light. She realized that she had begun to know him, this quiet man with his steady work ethic and hidden depths. "We can do this every evening if you like," she offered. "I would like that very much." They fell into a rhythm, a routine that shaped their days. Ian worked on the cabin with single-minded determination, knowing they needed solid shelter before the serious snows came. Victoria managed the camp and began to explore their surroundings, discovering wild berries she preserved for winter, identifying edible plants, watching the patterns of wildlife. She had lived her whole life in town, and the wilderness was revealing itself to her gradually, a book written in a language she was only beginning to learn. As they worked side by side day after day, Victoria found herself watching Ian with growing curiosity. He was unfailingly patient with her when she struggled with unfamiliar tasks, quick to praise her successes, thoughtful in his habits. He respected the boundary between them, sleeping on his side of the canvas shelter with careful distance. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and wondering. One afternoon in late October, Victoria was washing clothes in the stream when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up to see 3 riders approaching their camp. Ian immediately moved to intercept them, positioning himself between the strangers and Victoria. His hand rested casually on the pistol at his hip, not threatening, but ready. "Afternoon," called the lead rider, a grizzled man with a gray beard. "Saw your smoke, thought we would check who our new neighbors are." Ian relaxed slightly. "Ian Oakes, this is my wife, Victoria. We are homesteading here." The 3 riders introduced themselves as fellow homesteaders from properties farther down the valley. They had heard someone was settling nearby and wanted to welcome them to the area. Victoria brought coffee, and the men sat around the fire, trading information about the area, discussing water rights and the best places to hunt, warning about where the snow drifted deepest in winter. "You will want to get that cabin finished before November," one of the men advised, looking at the partially constructed walls. "Weather can turn fast up here." "Working on it every daylight hour," Ian assured him. After the neighbors left, Victoria said, "They seemed friendly." "Homesteaders tend to look out for each other," Ian said. "It is too hard a life not to." The encounter heartened Victoria. They were not completely isolated out here. There were other people, potential friends, the possibility of community. She thought of Weaverville, where everyone had known her business and judged her accordingly, and realized that here, no one cared about her past. They would judge her only by who she proved to be now. November arrived with cold rain that turned the ground to mud and made every task more difficult. Ian worked through the weather, determined to get the cabin roofed and chinked before snow fell. Victoria helped when she could, mixing mud to fill the gaps between logs, holding timbers while he secured them. She had never imagined herself doing such work, but she discovered a pride in it, in creating something solid and real with her own hands. The day Ian finished the roof, they both stood back and looked at what they had built. It was small, just one room, perhaps 16 feet square, with a dirt floor and a single window. But it was sturdy, the walls tight, the roof solid. Ian had built a stone fireplace in one corner, and the sheet metal stove they had bought sat ready to provide heat. "It is not much," Ian said, and Victoria heard uncertainty in his voice. "It is ours," Victoria replied. "That makes it everything." They moved their belongings inside that evening, arranging the space carefully. Ian built a simple bed frame in one corner, stuffed a tick mattress with pine needles and dried grasses. He constructed shelves where Victoria could keep her books. They set up the small table and two chairs Ian had made from split logs. By the time they finished, snowflakes were beginning to fall, soft and silent in the twilight. That night, lying in the cabin with the fire crackling in the hearth and snow whispering against the walls, Victoria felt something she had not experienced in years. Safety, peace, home. "Thank you," she said into the darkness. "For what?" Ian's voice came from his bedroll on the floor. He had insisted she take the bed. "For this, for all of it. For offering me a choice when I had none. You gave me something too," Ian said quietly. "A reason to stop running. A reason to build something permanent." As winter settled over the valley in earnest, Victoria and Ian learned to live in close quarters through the dark months. The cabin that had seemed adequate suddenly felt tiny when they were trapped inside by blizzards that lasted for days. They developed careful courtesies, small ways of giving each other privacy and space. Ian would announce he was going to check on the animals, giving Victoria time alone. Victoria would busy herself with mending or cooking, giving Ian room to move about without feeling watched. But they also grew closer through the enforced intimacy. They talked more than they ever had before, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing their hopes for the future, arguing good-naturedly about the books Victoria read aloud. Ian told her about his years after his mother's death, the hardships and small kindnesses of life on the road. Victoria described her mother's final illness, her growing conflict with her father, the moment she realized she could not live the life he demanded. One evening in December, during a lull in the storms, Ian produced a small package wrapped in paper. "I had this made in Lewiston before the snows came," he said, handing it to Victoria. "Consider it a late wedding gift." Inside was a simple wooden sign, carefully carved and sanded smooth. It read, "Oaks Homestead Library," with a small shelf already attached beneath it. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "Ian, this is beautiful. Thought you should have a proper place for your books," he said, looking pleased by her reaction. "We can mount it above your shelves, and when we build a bigger house someday, we will make sure it has a real library room." She crossed the small cabin and, without thinking, hugged him. Ian stood frozen for a moment, then carefully put his arms around her. It was the first time they had truly embraced, and Victoria was suddenly aware of his warmth, his strength, the steady beat of his heart under her ear. When she stepped back, they both looked at each other with new awareness, a recognition of something shifting between them. "Victoria," Ian began, then stopped, seeming unsure how to continue. "Yes?" she prompted, her own heart racing. "I know we married for practical reasons," he said slowly, "and I promised you partnership, not expectations. But I want you to know that I have come to, that is, I find myself, what I mean is." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I am making a mess of this." Victoria felt a smile tugging at her lips despite her nervousness. "Are you trying to tell me that your feelings have changed?" "Yes," Ian said gratefully. "Yes, that is exactly what I am trying to say. I have developed, well, real feelings for you. Not just respect or friendship, though those too, but something more. And I want you to know that, but I also want you to know that it does not change anything. You do not owe me anything. I gave you my word about what this marriage would be, and I will keep it. I just thought you should know the truth. Victoria's hands were trembling. She set the sign down carefully on the table. And if I told you that my feelings have changed as well, that when I watch you working, or listen to you laugh at something I have read, or wake up and feel grateful you are here, I am feeling more than gratitude or friendship. Ian's eyes widened. Are you saying that? I believe I am, Victoria said, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must surely hear it. I did not expect this. I thought we would be partners, colleagues, friendly companions at best, but somewhere along the way, you became more than that to me. Ian crossed the space between them in two strides. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hands, his eyes searching hers. May I kiss you? Properly, I mean? Yes, Victoria whispered. The kiss was nothing like the chaste peck he had given her at their wedding. It was warm and searching, full of months of growing affection finally allowed expression. Victoria's hands came up to grip his shoulders, and she kissed him back with all the feelings she had been afraid to acknowledge. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ian rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted. Only weeks? Victoria teased. I have been thinking about it since that day you finished the cabin roof, and I saw you standing there so proud of what you had built. Ian laughed, a sound of pure joy. We have both been dancing around this then. Apparently so. That night, Ian did not sleep in his bedroll on the floor. They lay together in the small bed, holding each other, talking softly, stealing kisses, learning the new territory of being not just partners but truly married. It felt like beginning again, like their real wedding night, even though months had passed since the ceremony. As winter deepened, so did their relationship. The cabin that had felt cramped now felt cozy, an intimate space where they built not just a home, but a marriage based on genuine love. They made love with tender discovery, learning each other's bodies as they had learned each other's minds and hearts. Victoria had been afraid that physical intimacy might change the easy partnership they had developed, but instead, it deepened it, adding new dimensions to their connection. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply, with a small pine tree Ian cut and dragged to the cabin, decorated with strings of dried berries Victoria made. She gave him a scarf she had knitted from wool she had carefully unraveled from an old sweater and reknit. He gave her a leather-bound journal and a precious pencil so she could write down her own thoughts and observations. You are always reading other people's words, Ian said. I thought maybe you would like to write your own. That night, by firelight, Victoria opened the journal and wrote her first entry. I am Victoria Oakes and I am home. January and February passed in a blur of snow and cold. Their supplies held, carefully rationed. The three neighbors who had visited in October checked on them twice, breaking trail through deep snow to make sure the newcomers were surviving their first mountain winter. Victoria and Ian returned the visits when weather allowed, and Victoria found herself building friendships with the other homesteading families, especially with Martha, the wife of the nearest neighbor, a woman just a few years older who shared Victoria's love of reading. I have 6 books, Martha said wistfully one afternoon when she and her husband had come for coffee. I have read them each a dozen times. You are welcome to borrow any of mine, Victoria offered immediately. Ian and I could bring some by next time we visit. Martha's face lit up. Truly? Oh, that would be wonderful. Though I must warn you, I am a slow reader. It might be months before I return them. Take all the time you need, Victoria assured her. What good are books if they are not shared? In March, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Ian and Victoria made plans for the season ahead. They would plant a large garden, enough to feed them through the next winter with surplus to trade. Ian wanted to acquire some cattle, start building a herd. Victoria wanted to plant fruit trees, thinking ahead to the years to come. One evening, as they discussed their plans, Ian said thoughtfully, "You know, there are 4 or 5 families in this valley now, and more coming all the time. Children who need schooling. You have mentioned wanting to teach." Victoria looked up from the sock she was darning. "Are you suggesting I start a school?" "I am suggesting you could if you wanted to. We could add a room to the cabin, or build a separate small building. Families would pay what they could, maybe in goods, if not cash. You would have your books, your teaching, all the things you thought you had to give up." "You would not mind?" Victoria asked. "The disruption, the noise of children?" Ian smiled. "I married you knowing you were meant for more than just keeping house. This homestead is yours as much as mine. If you want to use part of it for a school, then we will make it happen." Victoria set aside her mending and climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think luck had nothing to do with it," Ian said, holding her close. "I think it was 2 people who knew what they needed and were brave enough to reach for it." As spring transformed the valley from white to green, Victoria and Ian worked with renewed energy. They planted their garden, neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Ian built a chicken coop and bought 6 hens from a farmer in Lewiston so they would have fresh eggs. Victoria started seeds for flowers, wanting beauty as well as utility around their home. In April, Victoria realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be certain before telling Ian. When she did, sitting by the stream where they had first met as man and wife, he stared at her in wonder. "A baby?" he said, his voice hushed. "Truly?" "Truly," Victoria confirmed. "Sometime in late autumn, I believe." Ian whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are going to be parents," he said, still holding her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "We are going to have a family." That summer, as Victoria's belly began to swell with their child, Ian worked on expanding the cabin. He built a new room that could serve as both a bedroom for them and eventually a nursery. The original single room would become the main living space, and if Victoria still wanted it, a schoolroom. In June, a new family arrived in the valley, settling on a claim about 3 miles from the Oaks homestead. They had 5 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. When Victoria visited to welcome them, the mother, a tired-looking woman named Sarah, asked almost immediately if Victoria knew of any schools in the area. "I am planning to start one," Victoria said. "Small, just the valley children. Basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. I was thinking of beginning in the fall, after harvest." Sarah looked like she might cry from relief. "That would be a godsend. My children have had almost no formal education. We have been on the move for years." Word spread quickly through the small community. By midsummer, Victoria had commitments from 4 families, a total of 11 children. It would be a one-room school of the most basic sort, but it would be a school nonetheless. She spent her evenings planning lessons, organizing her books into those suitable for different ages, writing out alphabet primers and basic arithmetic problems in her precious journal. Martha, her friend from the neighboring homestead, volunteered to help. "I am no teacher," she admitted, "but I could assist with the younger ones while you work with the older children, and maybe I could learn alongside them, improve my own reading and writing." "That would be wonderful," Victoria said warmly. This was becoming more than she had imagined, a real school, a community resource, something that would outlast them all. In August, Ian finished the new room and began work on benches for the schoolroom. He made a blackboard from a piece of wood he sanded smooth and painted with a mixture of egg whites, lime, and charcoal that Victoria had found a recipe for in one of her books. It was not perfect, but chalk showed up well enough on it. Victoria was 6 months pregnant now, moving more slowly but still active and involved in everything. The baby kicked vigorously, especially in the evenings, and Ian would place his hand on her belly and talk to the child, telling stories about the homestead, the animals, the life they were building. Boy or girl, do you think? He asked one night. I do not know, Victoria admitted, but either way, this child will grow up surrounded by books and learning and love. That is what matters. September brought cooler weather and the beginning of harvest. The garden had done well, and Victoria and Ian spent long days preserving food for winter, canning vegetables, drying herbs, storing root vegetables in the small cellar Ian had dug into the hillside behind the cabin. It was hard work, but satisfying, seeing the literal fruits of their labor stored away against the cold months ahead. The school began the first Monday of October. 11 children ranging in age from 6 to 15 crowded into the main room of the cabin, sitting on the benches Ian had made, staring at Victoria with expressions ranging from eager to apprehensive. Martha sat in the back with the youngest ones, ready to help. Victoria stood before them, 7 months pregnant and more nervous than she had ever been, and smiled. Welcome, she said. My name is Mrs. Oakes, and I am very glad you are all here. We are going to learn together this year, reading and writing, arithmetic and history, grammar and geography. But more than that, we are going to learn that education is a gift, a tool you can use to build whatever life you choose. No one can take it from you once you have it. She thought of her father as she spoke, of Harold Pritchard, of everyone who had tried to make her believe that books and learning were frivolous, unsuitable for a woman. She thought of Ian's mother, beaten for the crime of reading. She thought of all the children who had never had the opportunity to learn. Let us begin, she said, and opened her most precious book, a worn copy of McGuffey's primer that had taught her to read all those years ago. The children were a mixed group, some already able to read a little, others starting from scratch. Victoria found herself energized by the challenge, creating lessons that could engage multiple skill levels at once, using Martha's help to work with small groups. The parents had agreed to pay what they could, some in cash, others in goods. The Smiths provided fresh milk from their cow twice a week. The Johnsons gave them a young pig that would be ready for slaughter by winter. The other families contributed flour, eggs, vegetables, firewood. By late October, the school had become the center of the small valley community. Parents would linger after dropping off their children, sharing news and gossip, helping each other with problems. Several of the mothers asked Victoria if she could teach them to read in the evenings, and she began holding adult classes twice a week by lamplight, with Ian sitting in as well, always eager to improve his own skills. On a cold morning in early November, Victoria woke to contractions. She labored through the day with Martha attending her while Ian paced outside, chopping wood with furious energy to burn off his nervous anxiety. As evening fell, Victoria delivered a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's brown eyes. Ian cried when he held his son for the first time, great heaving sobs of joy and relief that Victoria had survived, that the baby was healthy, that this impossible dream they had built was now complete. He is perfect, Ian said, his voice choked. What should we name him? They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at her husband holding their child with such tenderness, Victoria knew exactly what she wanted. Henry, she said. Henry James Oakes. Henry for strong, James for my mother's father. Henry, Ian repeated, smiling down at the baby. Welcome to the world, son. The school closed for 2 weeks while Victoria recovered. The parents were understanding, and several of the mothers brought food and helped with household chores so Victoria could rest. Ian took over all the heavy work and more, cooking and cleaning with surprising competence, always attentive to Victoria and the baby's needs. When the school reopened, Victoria brought baby Henry with her, nestled in a cradle Ian had made from bent willow branches. The children were fascinated by the infant, the older girls especially eager to help. Victoria found she could teach with Henry nearby, pausing when he needed to nurse, letting the older students lead lessons for the younger ones when she was occupied. Winter came again, their second in the valley, and this time it felt completely different. The cabin was warm and solid, their stores plentiful. They had friends, community, purpose. Victoria would sometimes lie awake at night, listening to Ian's steady breathing on one side and Henry's soft baby sounds on the other, and marvel at the journey that had brought her here. She thought of that day in Weaverville's town square, facing her father's ultimatum, choosing books over the security of a loveless marriage. If someone had told her then that within a year she would be married to a man she loved deeply, teaching school in her own home, mother to a beautiful baby boy, she would not have believed it possible. Life had proven stranger and more wonderful than any novel she had ever read. Spring arrived, and with it came news from Lewiston. A letter had arrived at the general store, forwarded from Weaverville. Victoria's father had died during the winter, pneumonia taking him quickly. He had left his property and business to a distant cousin, making no mention of Victoria in his will. She read the letter twice, feeling complicated emotions: grief for what had never been, relief that she was truly free now, sadness for the years of conflict that could never be resolved. Ian held her while she cried, not trying to fix it or minimize it, just offering his solid presence. "He was still your father," Ian said quietly. "It is all right to mourn him." "I am mourning what he could have been," Victoria said. "The father who might have been proud of his daughter, who might have met his grandson, who might have learned that his way was not the only way." "Then mourn that," Ian said. "It is a loss worth grieving." In the years that followed, the Oaks homestead prospered. Ian built up a small but healthy cattle herd, selling beef to the mining camps and settlements scattered through the mountains. Victoria's school grew, attracting students from farther away, some boarding with families in the valley during the school year. She acquired more books through trade and occasional purchase, building a library that served the entire community. In 1881, Victoria gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Rose, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's determination. In 1883, another son arrived, Michael Thomas, quieter than his siblings but equally loved. The cabin expanded again, growing into a proper house with separate bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a dedicated schoolroom with large windows to let in the light. The Oaks family became pillars of the growing community. Ian served on the informal council that made decisions for the valley. Victoria taught multiple generations of children, watching as her earliest students grew up, married, had children of their own. She wrote letters for those who could not write, read documents for those who could not read, provided books and encouragement to anyone who sought learning. In 1890, a group of parents approached Victoria about making the school official, applying to the territorial government for recognition and funding. She was hesitant at first, worried that official oversight might mean official restrictions, but the parents assured her they wanted her in charge, her vision guiding the school's future. The application was approved, and the Oaks Valley School became an official institution. With the small amount of government funding, Victoria was able to hire Martha as a full-time assistant teacher and purchase proper textbooks and supplies. The rough wooden building Ian constructed specifically for the school, allowing the house to be just a home again, became a source of pride for the entire valley. On a warm evening in June of 1895, Victoria sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains. She was 42 years old now, her hair shot through with silver, her hands marked by years of work. Beside her, Ian rocked gently in the chair he had made, his own hair graying, his face weathered by sun and wind. Henry was 14 now, already tall and strong, helping his father with the cattle. Lily was 12, a voracious reader who had gone through every book in the house twice. Michael was 10, quiet and artistic, always drawing pictures of the landscape around them. "Do you ever regret it?" Ian asked suddenly. "Choosing the path you did, all those years ago in Weaverville?" Victoria thought about it seriously, as she always did when Ian asked important questions. No, she said finally. Not even for a moment. I lost a father who could not love who I truly was, but I gained a husband who could, children who are growing up free to be themselves, a community that values learning. I gained a life I chose rather than one chosen for me. I am glad, Ian said simply, because that day by the creek, when I saw you sitting there looking so lost, I knew I had found something important. I just did not know yet how important. You offered me both, Victoria said, reaching over to take his hand. Books and love, learning and partnership. You told me it was a false choice, and you were right. We were both right, Ian corrected. You had the courage to refuse the false choice. I just provided an alternative. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the day fade into twilight. Inside the house, they could hear the children talking and laughing, normal evening sounds. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. The creek that ran through their property burbled over its stones, the same sound it had made for centuries, the same sound it would make for centuries to come. Victoria thought about all the stories she had read over the years, all the happy endings she had encountered in books. She had learned that happy endings were not really endings at all, but rather points of arrival, moments when the struggle transformed into something sustainable and good. This was her happy ending, this evening on the porch with the man she loved and the life they had built together. But it was not an ending. Tomorrow she would teach school again, watching young minds open to the possibilities of learning. Tomorrow Ian would work with the cattle, making plans for expanding the herd. Tomorrow their children would grow a little more, becoming the people they were meant to be. Tomorrow the creek would flow, and the mountains would stand, and the valley would be home. In 1898, when Victoria was 45 and Ian was 49, they traveled to Sacramento on business, selling a large portion of their herd to buyers from San Francisco. It was the farthest either of them had traveled since establishing their homestead 20 years earlier. Walking through the city streets, seeing the bustling crowds and modern conveniences, Victoria felt like a visitor from another world. "Do you ever wish we had settled somewhere like this?" she asked Ian as they stood outside a grand hotel. "Somewhere with more opportunities, more culture." Ian looked at her with genuine surprise. "Not for one moment, do you?" Victoria watched the hurrying crowds, the carriages rattling past, the endless noise and motion. She thought of their quiet valley, the sound of children reciting lessons, the peaceful evenings on their porch. "No," she said firmly. "I was just curious if you did." "Our valley is culture enough for me," Ian said. "We have books and music and learning. We have neighbors who care about each other. We have children growing up strong and free. What more could we need?" They completed their business quickly and returned home, both of them eager to get back to the land they had claimed and tamed and transformed into something precious. The children greeted them with wild enthusiasm, full of stories about everything that had happened in their absence. The neighbors had checked on them daily, Martha reporting that school had continued smoothly in Victoria's absence. That evening, unpacking their bags, Victoria found a book she had purchased in Sacramento, a new novel by an author she admired. She ran her hand over the cover, thinking about the girl she had been, standing in Weaverville's town square with a crate of books in her arms, facing exile and uncertainty. That girl had not been able to imagine this future, this richness, this fullness of life. "What are you thinking?" Ian asked, watching her from across the room. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Victoria said, "and how grateful I am that you stopped by that creek 20 years ago." "Best decision I ever made," Ian said with a smile. "Offering you both when the world said you had to choose one or the other." "Best decision I ever made was saying yes," Victoria replied. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th began, the Oaks family continued to grow and thrive. Henry, at 18, announced his intention to study law, wanting to use his education to help homesteaders navigate the increasingly complex legal system. Victoria and Ian were enormously proud, scraping together the money to send him to school in San Francisco. Lily declared her intention to become a teacher like her mother and began formally assisting with the younger students. Michael showed a talent for veterinary work, learning to care for the valley's animals with instinct and knowledge. The school educated more than 100 children over the years, and Victoria kept careful records, tracking their progress even after they left her classroom. She corresponded with former students who had moved to cities, who had become teachers themselves, shopkeepers, ranchers, mothers and fathers, passing on the love of learning to their own children. The little school in Oaks Valley had sent ripples out into the world, changing lives in ways Victoria had never anticipated. In the winter of 1905, when Victoria was 52 and Ian was 55, they celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. The children, now mostly grown, organized a surprise party, inviting seemingly everyone in the valley. The house overflowed with people, with laughter and music, and the shared memories of 2 decades of community building. Martha gave a speech, her voice strong and clear, so different from the hesitant woman she had been years ago when she first asked to borrow books. Victoria and Ian Oakes showed us all what it means to build a life on principle, she said to the gathered crowd. When Victoria chose books over a loveless marriage, she was choosing herself, choosing to believe her dreams mattered. When Ian offered her partnership and respect alongside that love, he was choosing to see women as fully human. Together, they built not just a homestead, but a community founded on those same principles. We are all richer for their courage, Victoria cried, and Ian held her hand tightly, his eyes bright with emotion. Around them, their neighbors and friends raised glasses in toast. Henry, home from law school for the celebration, stood tall and proud. Lily beamed with joy. Michael, always quieter, smiled his gentle smile. This, Victoria thought, was what success looked like. Not wealth or fame, but love and community and purpose woven together into something enduring. The years continued their steady march. Victoria taught until she was 60, finally retiring when her eyes grew too weak to read for hours each day. Lily took over the school, bringing her own ideas and energy while maintaining the foundation her mother had built. Ian scaled back his cattle operation but never fully retired, always happiest when working the land. They became grandparents, Henry's wife giving birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Lily married a young rancher from a neighboring valley and had 3 children in quick succession. Michael eventually found love with a widow who had 2 children of her own, blending families with gentle patience. On a summer evening in 1915, Victoria and Ian sat in their customary spot on the porch, now in their 60s and showing the wear of long lives fully lived. Around them, grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter a sweet sound. Through the open windows, they could hear Lily teaching one of her daughters to read, the careful sounding out of letters forming words, forming meaning. "We did all right, did we not?" Ian said, his voice carrying the rasp of age now. "We did more than all right," Victoria said. "We built something beautiful." "Your father was a fool," Ian said, not for the first time over the years. "He could have had all this, could have known these children, seen what his daughter created." "He made his choice," Victoria said philosophically. "As did I. We each chose what we valued most and lived with the consequences." "Do you still have that copy of Jane Eyre?" Ian asked suddenly. "The one that traveled all the way from Missouri?" "Of course," Victoria said. "It is in the library with all the others." "Read it to me tonight," Ian said. "Like you used to do in that first winter, when we were still learning each other." That evening, after the grandchildren had been collected by their parents, after the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Victoria read aloud while Ian listened, just as they had done countless times over the course of their marriage. Her voice was not as strong as it once had been, and Ian's hearing was not as sharp, but the story still wove its magic, transporting them both to another time and place while grounding them firmly in the moment they had created together. When she finished the chapter, Victoria closed the book gently. "Do you remember the first time I read this to you? That winter when we were still practically strangers? We were never really strangers, Ian said. From that moment by the creek, I felt like I knew you, or at least knew what mattered most about you. That I loved books, that you loved yourself enough to fight for who you were, Ian corrected. The books were just the symbol. What I recognized was the courage. Victoria set the book aside and moved to sit beside Ian on the old sofa they had bought years ago in Lewiston. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his familiar warmth. They had been married for 37 years, had built a homestead and raised a family and educated a community. They had faced droughts and harsh winters, loss and disappointment, the normal sorrows that came with living. But they had faced it all together, partners in every sense of the word. If I had to do it all again, Victoria said, I would not change a single thing. Every choice, every challenge, every moment of doubt, they all led here. To this life. To you. Even if you could have your father's approval? Ian asked gently. Even if there had been an easier path? Especially then, Victoria said firmly. Because the easy path would not have led to this, to us, to everything we have built. My father wanted me to be small, to fit into the narrow space he thought women should occupy. You showed me I could be expansive, could claim as much space as I needed, could build a life as big as my dreams. We did it together, Ian reminded her. I could not have built this without you. Partners, Victoria said, as she had said so many times over the years. Partners, Ian agreed. In 1920, when Victoria was 67 and Ian was 70, they celebrated their 42nd anniversary with their children and grandchildren around them. The homestead had grown into a substantial ranch, operated primarily by Michael and his family now. The school had expanded, now serving multiple valleys, with 2 additional teachers working alongside Lily. Henry had become a respected lawyer in Sacramento, but visited often, always bringing his family home to the valley. The world had changed dramatically since that day in 1878, when Victoria had stood in Weaverville's town square, choosing books over a husband she did not love. Women had won the right to vote. The frontier had officially closed, the Wild West tamed and settled. Automobiles were replacing horses on many roads, though not in the high mountain valleys where roads were still rough and uncertain. But some things had not changed. Children still needed education. Communities still needed to support each other. Love still mattered more than convention. And books still held the power to transform lives, to open minds, to offer possibilities beyond the visible horizon. Victoria's original 23 books, carefully preserved, now sat in a place of honor in the Valley School Library, which had been named the Everett Oaks Memorial Library, honoring both the name Victoria had been given and the name she had chosen. Hundreds of additional volumes filled the shelves, donated by former students, purchased with school funds, gifted by grateful parents. The small sign Ian had made all those years ago, Oaks Homestead Library, hung on the wall, a reminder of how everything had started. On a crisp October morning in 1922, Ian was working near the barn when he suddenly collapsed. Michael, working nearby, ran to him calling for help. They carried Ian into the house and sent for the doctor in Lewiston, but everyone who saw him knew the truth. His heart, which had been strong for 72 years, was finally failing. Victoria sat beside his bed, holding his hand, her heart breaking but her face calm. Their children gathered, grandchildren peeking in with worried faces. Ian drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in memories. Victoria, he said clearly during one lucid moment. My Victoria. I am here, she said, tears streaming down her face. I am right here, love. Did good, did we not? He asked, his voice weak. Built something worth building? We did, Victoria said. We built something beautiful and lasting. Everything we dreamed and more. Read to me? Ian asked. One more time? Victoria reached for the book on the bedside table, the same worn copy of Jane Eyre that had survived all these years. She opened to a passage near the end, where Jane returns to Rochester, and read aloud, her voice steady despite her grief. "Reader, I married him," Victoria read, and Ian smiled faintly. Those had always been his favorite words, the simple declaration of love chosen and claimed. Ian died as the sun was setting, peacefully, with Victoria's voice in his ears and his children around him. He had lived 72 years, and the last 44 of them had been full of purpose and love and satisfaction. It was, everyone agreed, a good death at the end of a well-lived life. Victoria grieved deeply and truly. After 44 years of partnership, the world felt wrong without Ian in it. But she did not retreat into sorrow. She had learned too much, built too much, become too much to disappear into widowhood. She continued to be involved in the school, though she no longer taught. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, passing on stories and values and love. She worked on her journals, which had grown into volumes over the years, documenting not just her own life but the history of their valley and community. On a spring morning in 1925, Victoria was sitting on the porch when a young woman arrived, travel-worn and uncertain. She introduced herself as Charlotte, a teacher from a small town in Idaho, who had heard about the Oaks Valley School and wanted to learn about Victoria's methods. "I heard you built a school out of nothing," Charlotte said, "that you were cast out for choosing books over marriage, and that somehow you ended up with both. I want to know how. I want to know if it is possible for others, or if you were just lucky." Victoria looked at this young woman, seeing echoes of her younger self, the hunger for more, the refusal to accept false choices. "Come inside," she said. "Have some tea. Let me tell you a story." They sat in the kitchen where Victoria had fed her family for decades, and Victoria told the story she had lived. She told about standing in the town square with her books, about meeting Ian by the creek, about the offer he had made, and the courage it took to accept it. She told about the hard work of homesteading, the joy of building something from nothing, the satisfaction of teaching and learning and growing. "It was not luck," Victoria said, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. "It was choice. I chose to believe I deserved more than what was being offered. Ian chose to believe women were fully human and deserved to be treated as such. Together, we chose to build something based on mutual respect and shared dreams. Those choices had consequences, some hard, some wonderful, but they were our choices, and we owned them fully." Charlotte listened with shining eyes. "And you think others could do the same?" "I think every person has to decide what they are willing to fight for and what they are willing to sacrifice," Victoria said. "The particulars will be different for everyone, but the principle remains. Do not let anyone else define who you are or what you can be. Choose yourself, even when it is frightening. And if you are very fortunate, you will find someone who chooses you right back, who sees your full humanity and celebrates it rather than trying to diminish it." Charlotte stayed for 3 days, observing the school, talking to students and former students, learning everything she could. When she left, she carried a bundle of books Victoria had given her and a letter of introduction to the Territorial Education Board. 2 years later, Victoria received a letter from Charlotte. She had started her own school, was engaged to a man who supported her work, was building a life that honored all of who she was. Victoria added the letter to her journals, another piece of evidence that their story mattered, that the choices they had made rippled outward in ways they could never fully measure. In the summer of 1927, Victoria Oakes died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 74. She was surrounded by family, her house full of the people who loved her, her life full and complete. At her funeral, more than 200 people gathered, former students and fellow teachers, neighbors and family, people whose lives had been touched by her courage and vision. Lily stood at the front of the gathering and spoke about her mother's legacy. "My mother taught me that we do not have to accept the limitations others try to place on us," she said. "She showed me through her life that a woman can be intelligent and educated and independent while also being a wife and mother and community member. She proved that books and love are not opposing forces, but complementary ones, that learning and living go hand in hand. The school she built will continue. The library she started will grow. The example she set will inspire generations to come. She chose books when the world told her to choose a husband, and she ended up with both, plus children and grandchildren, students and friends, a community, and a legacy. She chose herself, and in doing so, she gave all of us permission to do the same. They buried Victoria next to Ian on a hillside, overlooking the valley they had claimed and tamed and transformed. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and beautiful. The creek still bubbled over its stones, singing its endless song. And in the school that bore their name, children still learned to read, still discovered that books could open doors to infinite possibilities, still heard the story of the woman who refused to choose between who she was and who she might love, and the man who told her she could have both. The Oaks Valley School continued for decades, eventually becoming part of the public school system, but maintaining its commitment to literacy and learning. The library grew to thousands of volumes, serving the entire region. Victoria's journals were eventually published, providing historians with a detailed account of homesteading life and the building of Western communities. Her story became part of the lore of the region, told and retold, a reminder of courage and choice. And in quiet moments, on that porch where Victoria and Ian had spent so many evenings, their descendants would sometimes sit and watch the sunset, thinking about the day in 1878 when a woman chose books and a man offered her both books and love, and together they built something that outlasted them both, a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of something more precious, a life fully lived on their own terms, with love and learning and purpose woven together into something beautiful and lasting. The Wild West had been tamed, but the spirit that drove Victoria to stand in that town square, arms wrapped around her books, refusing to surrender who she was, that spirit lived on. In every child who learned to read, in every woman who chose herself, in every partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. She had been cast out for choosing books over a husband. A cowboy had said, "Choose both and live with me." And from that impossible beginning, they had built something extraordinary, a home, a family, a community, a legacy, a love story for the ages, written not in fiction, but in the daily choices of two people who refused to accept false limitations and dared to imagine something better. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and memory. But what they had built continued, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of choosing yourself, the courage of offering partnership, and the enduring truth that love and learning, books and family, independence and intimacy need never be opposing forces. They can be woven together into a life of richness and meaning if you are brave enough to reach for both and determined enough to build something lasting from that choice. In the end, Victoria Everett Oakes had proven that the greatest stories are not always found in books, though books can show us the way. Sometimes the greatest stories are the ones we live, the choices we make, the courage we find, and the love we build when we refuse to settle for less than we deserve. Her story, and Ian's, would be told for generations in that valley, a reminder that the Wild West was not just a place of cowboys and gunfights, mines and cattle drives. It was also a place where a woman could stand up for herself, a man could offer true partnership, and together they could build something that mattered, something that lasted, something that proved love and learning, books and family, could flourish together under the big western sky.